Not you.
If there is one thing Karl Rove understands, it's the difference between voter fraud and election fraud. Voter fraud is when someone votes twice or uses someone else's name to vote. It's fraud by a voter or defrauding a voter out of their vote. It's a minor crime because it only involves one vote. It's also relatively rare. Except if you listen to the people who commit election fraud. Election fraud is a big crime because it's not about one person's vote. It's about stealing entire elections. One way to commit election fraud is to steal an election, is to keep an entire group of people away from the polls. How do you do that? Usually by claiming you are defending against voter fraud. That's the method Karl Rove used when he pressured U.S. attorneys to bring bogus voter fraud cases and then canned the ones who refused. And on our number one story tonight, guess what Republicans say is a big problem in this election? That's right, voter fraud. The issue coming to a head last week in Illinois after Republican Senate candidate Mark Kirk was recorded without his knowledge talking about protecting against voter fraud in areas that are predominantly minority and predominantly Democratic. Now, why would Mr. Kirk want to protect mostly Democratic voters from having their votes stolen? That remains unclear, but in the tape you're about to hear, he does express concern that these areas are vulnerable. It's not clear whether he means the areas are vulnerable to him.
I have now funded the largest voter integrity program in the 50 years for the state of Illinois. These are lawyers and other people that will be deployed in key vulnerable precincts. For example, south and west side of Chicago, Rockford, Metro East, where the other side might be tempted to jigger the numbers somewhat.
Joliet, 1050 Addison Avenue. Democratic candidate Alexei Giannoulis, Kirk's rival in the close race, said in a statement yesterday that that sort of Florida-style voter intimidation is disgusting, illegal, and smacks of the Karl Rove politics that Illinois voters are sick of. Smacks of Karl Rove politics? How exactly? Well, the GOP has been soliciting help to get those voter integrity squads going into the vulnerable precincts. And according to the Giannoulis campaign, one of the speakers educating the Conservative Federalist Society in Chicago about voter fraud in Chicago today was Hans von Spakovsky, a former member of the Federal Election Commission and a former civil rights attorney in the Bush Justice Department. His specialty was protecting the country from voter fraud by preventing voters from voting. And not just any voters. His specialty was poor people, minorities, people who happen to vote Democratic, like when he got thousands of legal Maryland voters thrown out because of discrepancies between their personal info and how the info had been entered in government databases, and like when he approved a Georgia law similar to a poll tax, even after, maybe especially after, his own staff warned that it would discriminate against black voters. With us tonight is Michael Dorff, General Counsel for the Giannoulis campaign, formerly the counsel to Barack Obama's pre-president and a specialist in election law. Thanks for your time tonight, sir.
Thank you, Keith.
Can you course correct me or at least flesh out the distinction that I drew there between voter fraud on the one hand and election fraud on the other?
You got it just about right. Voter fraud involves individual voters, somebody who might be voting twice, somebody who might be coming in under a different address. And there's never been a systemic proof of systemic voter fraud. In fact, the nonpartisan Brennan Center said that there is more of a chance of getting hit by lightning than of finding somebody who voted twice.
Could you analyze Mr. Kirk's reference in that tape to the minority precincts? He called them vulnerable precincts. What does he mean by that? Vulnerable to whom and vulnerable why?
Well, we'd love to know, because it's one of the most cynical things that we've ever heard, and we've asked him to explain what vulnerable precincts is. We certainly know what it is. He's chosen precincts that are heavily African-American, heavily low-income, unemployed, the most vulnerable people there, and those people who are vulnerable to being intimidated by people in suits when they walk into the voting booth and saying, oh, if you have a parking ticket, you're going to be arrested on the spot if you vote. If you show the wrong registration or you make a mistake, you're going to be arrested. It is outrageous what Mr. Kirk has done.
So what are Democrats doing about this now that the taped evidence is extant?
Well, we're not going to let it happen. We've already sent out letters to each of the U.S. attorneys in the 3 federal districts in Illinois. We've also sent out letters to the state's attorneys in the counties that Mr. Kirk has targeted. We've sent letters out to the election commissions in those places as well. We're also gathering our own army of volunteers to help out, to man polls, to make sure that every voter has a chance to cast their ballot. And is AlexiForIllinois.com. We can use volunteers. We want people to come in and help really bring some integrity into Illinois with Alexi Anulias.
Mr. Dorff, when other Republicans have been caught doing this, they've talked about it like it was a game, a contest between a couple of school teams. What's the harm in stealing the other guy's mascot on game day? Is that your experience, or do Mr. Vance Pekovsky's activities today tell you that they're treating this like much more than a game?
Yeah, it's not a game, and it's very much the Karl Rove playbook. Almost 40 years ago, in the first election, Karl Rove was involved, and he came to Illinois. He lied about his identity. He stole an opposing candidate's letterhead, and he put out an invitation which he gave to homeless people, promising them free food and drink. And then he got caught 3 years later when it was discovered, and he said it was a youthful prank. Well, it's not a youthful prank to those homeless people who didn't get the food they were promised. It's not a youthful prank to people whose constitutional rights to cast their vote has been taken away by this type of intimidation.
Michael Dorff, the general counsel to the Giannoulias campaign in Illinois and election law specialist. Great thanks for your time tonight, sir.
Thank you.
That's October 14th. One thought in passing here. If you were Karl Rove, wouldn't you lie about your identity too? I'm Keith Olbermann. Good night.